Hello and welcome to the video lecture explaining or describing trigger syntax and routine syntax using the SQL standard, which is typically used. I like to show students this slide and kind of step through this slide because a great many times when you go to the internet, for instance, and you look up how to do the create trigger, you're going to see this kind of statement presented to you. So starting with the create trigger statement, you can see that you can have a before, after, or instead of trigger. So those are three different types of triggers, and each of these triggers can be based on a different kind of event or a multiple kind of event. So I could have a before insert, a before delete, a before update, all in the same trigger. I could have before insert trigger, I could have an after delete trigger, I could have an after insert trigger. I could have instead of triggers. Instead of triggers are used on complex queries. We talked about that a little bit in IT 117, talking about the complexity of views and your ability to send updates through them. A very simple query that you write will actually update its base tables. Depending on how complex that query is, the database management system may not be able to update the base table. So you can use an instead of trigger. So what it'll do is instead of trying to update through this query, I'm going to fire this trigger, which is going to do the updates for me in the background. As you can see, it's on table name. So again, the author is keeping the triggers associated with tables, but there are other kinds of triggers. There are database triggers and such. So not only do we have different kinds of triggers, but the triggers can behave differently. So we can set it up for each row or for each statement. So in that case, we've got a row level or a row level trigger or a statement level trigger. Now those are different in that if you set up a trigger that's for each row and you run an update statement, and this is an update trigger, and you run an update statement that affects 500 rows, that trigger is going to fire for each row. Whereas if you have a statement level trigger, it updates once simply due to the fact that you submitted an update statement. So maybe you're simply trying to keep track of the fact that somebody did an update, or you specifically want to know what that operation did to each of the rows. So depending on how you want to use the trigger, those are the different. And then you have when criteria. So for instance, if this is a payroll table and someone updated the table and updated a row, for instance, the when criteria would check to see whether or not, for instance, this person, the salary was updated by more than 5%. And then the triggering SQL is just any kind of update statement, or maybe I want to insert into an audit table. Anything like that can be done inside a trigger. Anything you can do inside a routine, you can do inside a trigger. The other interesting thing about triggers is triggers have access to not only what the data looks like now, it has access to what the data looked like before the trigger fired and after the trigger fired. Again, depending on what kind of a trigger you use. Because a before trigger, you haven't made the changes yet. So if you're in a before trigger, thank you. So if you're in a before trigger, the before trigger is not going to have access to the data as the data would look like after the trigger fired. So keep that in mind. So the bottom is create procedure and create function. So you use either one of those. So again, that bar is going to be, you either use this or you use this. Then the routine name. Then you could have any number of parameters. When you see the square brackets, that's optional. And then if it's a function, it can return data types, what language it uses, right? So it can actually use Pascal or COBOL or Ada. What are the parameter styles? It gets pretty crazy with the number of different things that you can do in here. Suffice to say, that is the trigger syntax and routine syntax associated with the SQL standard, the 2000 series standard of SQL. And that ends that video lecture. I think I've talked long enough. Actually, let me just give you one more slide. This is a comparison of the different vendors. So if we're looking at IBM, you see it's a create procedure. That's the procedure name. That's how you pass in parameters. Modifies SQL data begin, and we have a declare statement where we declare our variables and their data types. We have an if statement. We have a then clause, so that if the if is true, then it does this. And then we've got an update statement. Sybase is very similar, except that when you're passing in parameters, you use the @ symbol for parameters. You also use the @ symbol in front of your variable names. So it's a little different that way. And then in Oracle, we can have an in or an out parameter. And then we have our as number int, and then we have begin statement. So this is a little bit more similar like IBM, because Sybase and Microsoft don't require the begin statement or the end statement. And then the if, then, end if, and update are fairly similar across the board. Okay, so that ends my video lecture on the trigger and routine syntax.